Hi everyone, this is Elan Journo, a fellow and director of policy research here at the Ayn Rand Institute.
And I'm Ben Bayer, a fellow also at the Ayn Rand Institute. We both write for the online publication New Ideal.
And we sat down today because we want to talk about a newly significant phenomenon in the culture, tribalism. And I think it's really important for people to think about and understand and detect wherever they see it and then react to it and I think oppose it because I think it's a real problem. It's a topic that we hope to write more about in New Ideal, and it's a topic that we're going to be presenting on soon.
Yes, well, in particular because we have started to see this phenomenon pop up so many places in the culture and in politics, we decided to make this the theme of the Ayn Rand Student Conference, which is coming up soon in November in Atlanta. If you're interested in it, and you're a student, you can probably still get a scholarship to attend. It's early November, and the website for it is aynrandcon.org. Find out more about the speakers and the topics that we're discussing there. I'm going to be giving a talk about tribalism in politics. And actually, it's because of that topic that I started researching this a little bit more. And since there was a book that had just come out on the very same topic, I read the book and recommended it to Elan, and Elan read the book as well. It's this Political Tribes by Amy Chua. And so we wanted to talk about the book and some of the issues that it raises and some of the things that Ayn Rand has to say about these same issues today.
Yeah, so I think what our plan is for today, we're going to discuss the issue of tribalism, talk about what it is, and then use the book by Chua as a springboard into one very prominent analysis of this phenomenon, and then give our perspective, because I think we definitely differ in important ways from her view and from what I think are conventional approaches to it. So why don't we dive in? I think a natural starting point is, what is the phenomenon out there in the world? What are we talking about when we use the term tribalism? So I found an anecdote I want to share that I think captures some of what's going on. And this was in an article in the New York Times recently, and it recounts a valedictorian speech that was given, I think, last summer. And the valedictorian had a speech with all kinds of inspirational quotes. And the one in particular I'm going to read to you. And think about your reaction to who said this quote. So yeah, be honest with yourself. Think about exactly what you think of this. So the quote in the speech from the valedictorian was, "Don't just get involved. Fight for your seat at the table. Better yet, fight for a seat at the head of the table." End quote. Donald J. Trump. Now think about, do you like that quote? Does it appeal to you? Do you agree with it? Now, during the speech, part of what makes it so revealing as an anecdote is after the speech was given, the student kind of turned to the audience and said, "Actually, just kidding, that's not Donald Trump, that's Barack Obama." And the initial reaction was people were cheering and hooting, and then as soon as he said Barack Obama, people stopped. They were really quiet, and so I think some of them were booing him and jeering him. Now, that's interesting because if the messenger is a problem for you, why is that? Because the message is the same, whoever is saying it. If you agree with it when Donald Trump says it, why would you jeer it if Barack Obama is actually saying it, and vice versa? So we could have played that the other way around, right? I could have attributed it to Barack Obama and people would have recoiled and vice versa.
If it was in a different school that wasn't in the South.
That's right. So this happened in Kentucky.
Right.
So I think one of the places where Donald Trump has a lot of support. So what's interesting there is that I think the way this is interpreted as a anecdote is because they thought something positive was said by one of their people. Trump is part of our tribe. We're cheering for it. But wait a minute, if it's not from our tribe, it doesn't matter the content, we don't like it. So I think that's one small example. But you, recently in New Ideal, you wrote an article that I thought really captured another aspect of tribalism. Why don't you describe
it's a similar kind of example in that there's contradictory attitudes about the exact same idea depending upon who it is that's pitching the idea. And in this case, it was the reaction that I observed to the recent summit between President Trump and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. And the Trump supporters were very happy that he had this historic meeting, which a president hasn't done in probably decades, if not longer. And yet, here he's meeting with a dictator of a communist nation, trying to extend some concessions to him, certainly giving him a huge audience, treating him like he's a member of the civilized nations of the world, which is the exact same kind of thing that many conservatives condemned and criticized when they saw President Obama doing the same thing with Raul Castro back in, I think it was 2016, I think, or maybe 14, a few years ago. But it was only like a couple of years ago. And in that space of time, suddenly they do a 180 on whether you should be meeting with brutal communist dictators and giving them this kind of dignity and legitimacy.
Just to challenge it, so it's not as if some of the important factors were different. It's not as if you could say there's been marked change in North Korea or something that would make the difference for this kind of thing.
Right. In fact, if anything, I would argue that meeting with Kim is a little worse because he's more brutal, if anything, than the Cuban regime, and certainly more of a military threat because, I mean, there's no longer any Cuban missile crisis. There's now a North Korean missile crisis.
I think it's important to get that. Another aspect of the phenomenon of tribalism is that I don't think it's restricted to sort of the conservative, so-called political right in the country. I think there's definitely, if you look to the sort of progressive, liberal, left-wing, in quotes, scare quotes, I would say, side of the political scene, you definitely see tribalism, but it takes a slightly different form sometimes. And I think one of the manifestations is what's called identity politics.
Yeah. Sure.
So now you've been, before you joined here at the Institute, you were on campus. So maybe you can share some experiences of what does this look like?
Well, I didn't see any major examples of it on the particular campus that I taught at, but at least none that I want to share. There've definitely been examples of it come up that I've read about, and the Chua book actually, I think, gives some pretty good examples. And this is one of the things I found valuable about it, is just as a repository of data for examples of tribalism on both sides of the political spectrum, because she's, even though I think she considers herself to be some kind of liberal, she's definitely sensitive to the fact that there are problems on the left, and she's critical of it. And so, yes, she comments precisely on the issue of identity politics, and she spends a lot of time especially talking about the whole debate about cultural appropriation, which is, the way that I sometimes describe it is, back in the 90s when I was in college, if you wanted to display to the world that you were a liberal, progressive, kumbaya type of person, you might, and let's suppose you're a white guy. You might dread your hair and wear a Rasta cap and some tie-dyes, and this was cool and hip. But nowadays, if that would be the wrong thing to do from the left's perspective, because these are different kinds of ethnic garb, and they belong to the ethnic group that allegedly originated them, and people from a different ethnic group shouldn't try to appropriate them. And so, each ethnic group is seen as owning. It's a set of practices and language and style of dress and food. I mean, there have been controversies on campus about whether, the school dining hall should be serving sushi or whether there should be yoga classes or things like that, because that's seen as coming from a different culture than the Western European culture. That's, I think, the most overt manifestation of it on the left.
So let's pull some of these threads together and just kind of summarize what are some of the important features of tribalism today, as we've sort of from these examples, and we'll draw on others as we get into Chua's book. So what I'm taking it as significant is, one of the important features is it's my group, right or wrong. And my group is defined in some of those very concrete, almost sometimes biological ways, sometimes it's more defined in more cultural terms, but it's my group first, and it's group first perspective. And I think another one, which came out in the example you described with Trump's diplomacy, there's kind of an indifference or lack of concern for the right or wrong, or the sort of the intellectual side of it, like the moral dimension that's going on. I think there's one other aspect I want to just flag, and maybe we can get more into it. And I think it's the group first perspective comes with an implication, which is if you're not part of our group, if you're an outsider, there's always the people that can be blamed. Like, so if you are not a Republican, you're a Democrat, and we don't like the Democrats, and they're the ones gumming up the system, they're trying to throttle the economy, they're the enemy. And vice versa, if you're a Democrat or a progressive or a liberal, however you think of yourself, there's a way in which a lot of people think of it as, well, that's the enemy camp, they're the problem. And again, I think it's a non-ideological assessment. It's not as if, oh, their ideas are really, really bad and leading to these consequences. It's more like, that's the opposing team and we have to knock them down. It's that kind of a hostility that is very primal.
The team reference there, I think, is important because my own observation for several years now is that politics is becoming a lot more like sports. And in the following way. I mean, I think sports are great. But one of the things that's characteristic of sports is when you pick a team, it's based on rather superficial reasons why you pick the team to root for that you're going to pick. Maybe it's because this is where I just happen to live, or I like the color of their jersey, and it's fine to base your decision for who you're going to root for in sports on such a relatively superficial thing, because sports is just a game. Right? And it doesn't really matter in real life, which side takes the ball over the line at the end of the game. But if politics becomes like that, where you're choosing, which side of a political argument you're going to support based on characteristics that are not much less superficial than that. You like the way they look, and whether it's red or blue, and then that's a problem, because politics is not a game. It has real effects on people, and it's debating about real issues that matter, the truth of which matter. And yet, I think I sometimes see people who, my friend list on social media, who seem to have the same kind of attitude about sports as they do about politics, and their rooting behavior is about the same level, and that's a problem.
Well, let's now turn to sort of evaluating this, and I think one helpful thing about reading Amy Chua's book, Political Tribes, is, as you mentioned earlier, that she provides a lot of data, a lot of examples and case studies, and the book is primarily case studies. So why don't we spend a few minutes talking about her argument. I assume no one watching has actually read the book, or if you have read the book, that's great, but we're not counting on you to have read it. We'll give you a summary and sort of the basic arguments she presents, and then our take on them. So do you want to just give us a couple minutes summary on what's her argument in broad strokes? So we can dig into it?
She, as I mentioned before, she thinks that there is an increasing amount of tribalism. She thinks that it's problematic. And she illustrates this by surveying a variety of case studies, not only in the United States, but especially, and I think very interestingly, in other countries around the world. And I see it as useful, not just because it's not because I have a special interest in foreign policy, though I know, of course, you do, but because it gives you kind of the inductive data for what this trend means and what its implications are. And in some of the countries that she's looking at, you can imagine that this is, if our current tribalist trends continue in this country, this is maybe how it might end up looking. And several of the examples include, for instance, her assessment of the Vietnam War. And the way that it's typically understood, she thinks, in the West was as a conflict between capitalism and communism, which she acknowledges that it was on some level. But she thinks that there was an important ethnic tribal aspect to the conflict that was underappreciated at the time. She thinks that failing to appreciate it contributed to our losing the war, and that we should continue to look for these same kinds of factors. So for instance, the issue in Vietnam was that there's what she called a market-dominant minority of ethnic Chinese who were basically in control of the main levers of the South Vietnamese economy. Actually, they had been in the North too, but then when the North went communist, they pretty much they escaped to the South, and so then you have lots of ethnic Chinese living in the South and running most of the businesses and controlling most of the economy, and the majority Vietnamese population had, for a very long time, felt to be under the heel of these kind of, in effect, I mean, they're ethnic Chinese capitalists. And so when Ho Chi Minh enters the equation, who's first and foremost a kind of Vietnamese patriot, who has knowledge of the, many hundreds or thousands of years of conflict between Vietnam and China. China had invaded many times. He was able to play to these this ethnic resentment and say, the Americans are on the side of these ethnic Chinese, and if we want to kick the Chinese out, we need to kick out the capitalists and the Americans who are along with them. And she gives similar examples in other foreign conflicts, which we don't necessarily need to go into yet, but in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in Venezuela, which I thought was a very interesting discussion because she draws a lot of parallels between Hugo Chavez and how he rose to power and Trump in America, which is you might not have thought of because they're ostensibly from different ends of the political spectrum, but they play to a lot of the same kinds of factors.
Yeah, I would say in reading the case studies of Afghanistan and Iraq, where I have greatest knowledge of these examples, I thought her argument that there's an underappreciation for the importance of tribal identity or just sort of collective identity in those parts of the world. I think that I agree with that assessment. I think she's right. Her argument goes further, and I think her argument is that it was much more significant and maybe even the most significant factor to the point where religion and ideology are not that important. And that's where I think I disagree with her at a fundamental level. And I think maybe we can get into a little of how she thinks of tribalism, because I think that's one of the most interesting things about the book. So it's a substantive, in-depth treatment of this subject by someone who knows this, she's done her homework, she's a real scholar, and yet I think it's in the first few pages when she sets the table for the banquet, in effect, and the way she conceptualizes, the way she thinks of tribalism is fascinating, because we've given a few examples already, and I think we've identified some of the features of tribalism. So do you want to just share how she...
So here's the first paragraph of the book, which I think sums up the issue you want to discuss. Humans are tribal. We need to belong to groups. We crave bonds and attachments, which is why we love clubs, teams, fraternities, family. Almost no one is a hermit. Even monks and friars belong to orders. But the tribal instinct is not just an instinct to belong, it's also an instinct to exclude. And before we say more, I should mention she goes on to, in a later chapter, to actually cite a variety of psychological studies which she claims support the idea that there's this kind of tribal instinct that everybody has.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to cover. And I think we just want to pick out a few aspects. And one I would flag is, notice the examples. So a club, a family, a sort of ethnic group. Now, those are not all the same kind of things. They're importantly different, and it's Ayn Rand had a theory of how people think about things in the world, how you conceptualize them, how you put them under headings and terms, and her view is that sometimes people get that wrong, and when you get it wrong, it's bad for your thinking. It really muddles your thinking, and in this particular case, I think she would call it a package deal. You're putting things together that are in essential ways different, or importantly in terms of their evaluative dimensions, they're different and they don't belong together.
And you're suggesting her use of the concept tribe or tribalism is the one that's putting things together in a...
I think so, because many of the case studies I think are easier to understand under the heading of tribalism because they really are cases of tribalism. So if you go to Afghanistan, people do organize in terms of clans and tribes and so forth.
That's a paradigm case.
Yeah, and it is. That is, in fact, it's a good way to put it. But then when you dig into that, that phenomenon, the way people organize themselves into groups and exclude others and view things in terms of group first and group is right or wrong, regardless of right or wrong, that isn't exhausted by being born into the group. There's sort of that kind of behavior is also found And it's reinforced by certain ideological views. Like if you're religious, there are religions that function this is my view now, or this is my view in contrast to Chua, is that religion really can be a tribal phenomenon. And in many cases in the book, I think she's running those two together. And religion is something you can choose to be part of, and you can choose to leave. And that's different from you were born to this set of parents whose ancestry goes in that direction. That's a different kind of grouping.
So you're suggesting, for instance, that the monks that she mentions in that first paragraph, yes, it's true, they live in a monastery or in a cloister with other monks, but it could be that this monastery is open up to people from all kinds of different backgrounds and ethnicities and languages, and they are united by a common abstract ideological idea, which may be the wrong one, but they're not. They've chosen it and they have their reasons.
Yeah, or take a different kind of example that she cites, which is, so suppose you belong to Toastmasters as a club. Now, all kinds of people go to Toastmasters. Right. It's not a tribal group, although you could use it, you can behave, and it could become a tribal group. But in its essence, it's a voluntary association of people with a common interest, right, common goals, who collaborate to mutual advantage, and they can leave anytime they want.
And it's not like the one Toastmasters group is going to go fight in the streets, right, with the other right, Toastmasters group because they have the wrong color shirt on or something like that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to see that people choose to associate for particular goals, and they do it freely, and that's one kind of way in which people come together, but that's different in important ways from you were born on this side of the hill north of Kabul, and this is your clan, tribe, family, and all the nested kind of relationships that there, and other people view you as inseparable from that tribe. You view yourself as inseparable from it.
Yeah.
And your whole way of evaluating the world is it's my tribe versus that tribe, and it's versus the outsiders, right? And now that's a very different kind of grouping, and I don't think you can ram those two together, and it's not at all helpful.
So if it's not the case that any old group that anybody belongs to is a tribe, and it makes a difference what it is that's drawing people together into a group, what does make for a tribal group? What is tribalism in your view? Can we narrow it down?
Yeah, I mean, my thinking on this is deeply informed by my study of Ayn Rand's philosophy, and I think she actually has an analysis, of both sort of collectivism as the broad category of people going, sort of organizing around a group and subordinating the individual as a non-important function, and then she regards tribalism as a form of that. It's a very primitive form of collectivism. I think she has a penetrating analysis that's part of how I found, it's part of what led me to see some of the points of contrast with Chua, which is, do you want to share your...
Well, where she does most of this analysis is in an essay that appears in Philosophy Who Needs It called The Missing Link. And there's another one, this is one, and then I forgot to bring the book where the other major analysis is, which is in Global Balkanization,
right.
Which appears in The Voice of Reason. So, in other words, first of all, it's a form of collectivism. That means that if you're joining a group, but you're still recognizing your own agency and your own individuality and the importance of those distinctions, that's not tribalism. And then you said it was a more primitive form of collectivism than what? What's the contrast?
Well, I mean, one kind of collectivism is becoming a Marxist or a communist. When their view is there's a global class of proletarians, and we're all brothers in that. Now, at a certain point, that devolves into other things. I don't think that was sustainable, but that's a different conception of how you organize. And I think here, what I'm seeing as part of what's tribal in our culture and obviously in these other parts of the world is it's an approach that is anti-ideological, anti-intellectual, to more fundamentalist. It's a non-thinking kind of group membership, and and in its functioning, I don't want to think. I just want the group tells me what to think. In effect, if the group says this is good, it's good. If the group says it's not, it's not. and I don't have to be bothered by it. And if it goes beyond my group, then those people are suspicious. I don't have to deal with them. I think that's a contrasting feature that I think is important about tribalism.
Yeah, so this is, and part of what she emphasizes in Global Balkanization is that part of what makes it so unthinking and anti-ideological is that the basis for the group you're choosing is precisely some of these very superficial characteristics that we mentioned before. Characteristics like your skin color. It's easy to see the difference between one person's skin color and another. Much harder to see, well, what kind of values does the person have? It's easy to see whether they're part of your family, whether they're born in the same place, whether they're a male or a female. These are, the way that Ayn Rand described it, is their perceptual level as opposed to conceptual level. So the things you can see with your eyes as opposed to abstract ideas you think about that you have to judge the truth or the falsehood of. And in Global Balkanization, she gives lots of examples of how there's more and more breakdown of the world along these kind of ethnic tribal lines, giving examples of secessionist movements and early glimmerings of the kind of cultural appropriation language that you see today. This is back in the 70s.
So I would just pause here and say, we're talking about Amy Chua's book as a springboard, and I think there's it's valuable from the perspective of getting data and thinking about it and seeing how this scholar is trying to grapple with this concept. And we've identified a couple of ways in which I think she goes wrong, or I disagree with her conception of it. I think it's in some ways muddling the issue. I would make a plug for reading Ayn Rand's analysis here. Global Balkanization is an important essay in this, and The Missing Link. And also I think the related essay, I think it's Selfishness Without a Self, because I think here...
Special twist on the same theme in that essay.
And I think just to kind of zoom out a little, so I think it's clear we're both opposed to tribalism from our discussion and just raising it as a problem. Maybe we should talk a few minutes about, well, in contrast to what? Because that's one of the things I think when we have the student conference in November, Ayn Rand Con, where our theme is tribalism, or it's individualism in a time of tribalism. I think one of the motivations behind that conference was people feel pulled, and I think it's a real thing, that they feel pulled into different groups, and there's ways in which, whether it's your parents pulling you to church, whether it's your friends pulling you to this club, whether it's the things you're reading leading you to be hostile to other people in the political scene. There's ways in which the culture that we live in today, it has a kind of tribal undertow, if not, maybe that's an understatement. And my view is that the contrast, the ideal to which people should aspire to, the important value here is individualism. And that is really the sharpest contrast, because it is, it's about the individual having sovereignty over their life and their life being an end in itself. And they as the individual, have the responsibility to think and decide and choose who should I associate with, what groups should I belong to, and why. Not just kind of inherit them because you're born into them or because your parents told you were born to a Lutheran family, you're going to be a Lutheran. That's it. But that doesn't make sense. I mean, people, why that? Why not something else? It's interesting because in the last few minutes that we have, I think it's worth sort of circling back to how she describes this phenomenon of tribalism. And it's in the subtitle, I think it's or at least it's early in the book, she talks about it as an instinct, the group instinct and the fate of nations. Now, this is an area where I think you have more knowledge than I do, but instinct as a way of thinking about human beings, I don't find that helpful. I mean, I don't, maybe there's work done to clarify what it is, but I take it as it conveys a view of human nature, I mean, a kind of a universal view of human nature that makes less important the feature of human life that I think is really fundamental, which is free will, and the fact that as an individual, part of what it means to form a vision of your life and pursue the goals that are important to you is using your mind and pursuing goals, and you have to choose to do that. You have to activate your mind. That's one of the insights in Ayn Rand's unique theory of free will. And I think what runs through Chua's book as an analysis of tribalism is, this is a fact of nature. that people are going to be tribal. We can mitigate it a little bit, and I don't think her answers to how to mitigate it are that helpful. But it's just it's inbuilt in a way that it sort of leans towards being, I think, deterministic, though she doesn't quite make that case. And that's where I think this kind of gets to a fundamental issue.
Yeah, so I've looked at some of the studies that she cites in support of this alleged tribal instinct, and I mean, there's evidence of something there that she's pointing to. The question is, what is it? And especially in light of the discussion we had previously about, well, what tribalism actually is. Tribalism is not just any preference you have for the people that you hang out with. It's choosing to join a group based on these relatively superficial perceptual level characteristics. And so of the studies that I looked at, I mean, some of them do show that, yes, there is such a thing as perceptual level processing, that some people will, when they're infants, will recognize differences in color before they look to bigger differences. And so they will, notice people in their own race, I think, more easily than people outside of the race. But that also then goes away very quickly.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that the studies, I think, show is that when you have chosen a group to join, you're going to be more motivated and more empathetic to members in your group. But some of the studies she cites actually show this kind of process works regardless of the reason for your group of choice. And it could be a non-ethnic grouping. It could be just like you've been divided into the red team and the blue team. But that's not tribalism.
Right.
That's a choice you've made to join that group.
I mean, I don't want to disparage Chua on this point, but in the way this comes up in the book, it definitely has a feel of, I already have this view, and here are some studies that kind of support it. Because I don't think I don't find it compelling at all that this is an inbuilt feature. So why don't we just wrap up? And I think it's useful to just sort of in a sentence or two, what's your takeaway from the book or from this issue? For me, this is an area I think is really important. I'm going to be writing more about it and speaking about it at the student conference, as you mentioned. And I think the other thing is it's fascinating to engage with someone like Amy Chua, where I think I disagree more than I agree with her, for sure. There's definitely value in the book, but I certainly disagree with her. And partly it's because I think it's where we disagree is I think it stems from philosophic disagreement. It isn't she's got the facts wrong, although that might be the case, but I don't think that's essential. It's, I think, her way of thinking about this, her frame of reference, sort of the worldview that she brings, even if she doesn't actually think she has one. There's a definite philosophy there, and I think it's part of what colors her approach. And in bringing an objectivist perspective, one informed by Ayn Rand's philosophy, I think helps you see that that's the way Chua is approaching it. And also, I think, helps you see the phenomenon out in the world clearer, or helps you get a handle on it better, because that's really what the end point is, right? What is out there and how do we understand it?
I think my takeaway point would be to refer the viewers to an article that a colleague of mine recently wrote, Aaron Smith. He wrote a piece called Why to Read Books by Thinkers You Disagree With. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't mention this book in particular, but I think this book is a really good example of the kinds of things that he discusses, because yes, there's I think a number of things to disagree with about her thesis, but first of all, she still has collected a lot of interesting data to think about that requires interpretation. She's offered her own interpretation. We might disagree with it, but there's a lot of new thinking I've had to do myself just to come up with, well, how do I interpret this data, and why exactly is she wrong, and what's she right about, and what's something that maybe we've not appreciated fully that she's mentioning. And there's more we could say about things I learned from reading the book, but we don't have time for it.
Well, we should definitely put a link to that in the show notes.
Yeah.
And thanks for watching. I would leave you with one thought. That article by Aaron is on New Ideal, where you can find more of our writing. And if you have questions or follow-up or challenges, we welcome that. Send us your input, and we'd love to hear from you. Thanks.